Venerables, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Buddha-Dharma Center of Hong Kong. The Buddha-Dharma Center of Hong Kong offers diploma and degree courses in Buddhist studies at the postgraduate level, taught by leading experts in the field. Anyone who is interested in learning Buddhism in a systematic manner is most welcome to apply. For more information, there are flyers on your seat. Today's talk is titled, How Buddhism Looks at Philosophical Theories, and the speaker is Professor Y. Karunadasa, a world-renowned scholar of early Buddhism and Theravada Abhidharma. Professor Karunadasa is Professor Emeritus at the University of California and a former director of its Graduate Institute of Pali and Buddhist Studies. He has served as a visiting professor at the University of London, the University of Toronto, and the University of Hong Kong. He has also served as the Untitled Chair at the University of Calgary. Currently, Professor is a visiting professor at this center. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor by giving him a round of applause.
You start.
Yes.
Okay. That's the PowerPoint. Yeah. Venerable bhikkhus and bhikkhunis of the Buddhist Sangha.
Close.
Venerable bhikkhus and bhikkhunis of the Buddhist Sangha. Dear friends in the Dhamma. The topic for my today's speech will be how Buddhism looks at philosophical problems, the Buddhist attitude to philosophy. So, yes. Now, as we all know, the ultimate goal of Buddhism is freedom from suffering. That is what Nibbana means. Freedom from all suffering is the ultimate goal of Buddhism. Yes, that's clear. That's called dukkha. Dukkha means suffering, end of suffering. But from an epistemological perspective, this means, from the point of view of Buddhist theory of knowledge, this means freedom from all theories, views and ideologies. Freedom from suffering means freedom from all theoretical views and ideologies. In other words, abandonment of all metaphysical and theological speculations. Now we come to the Buddhist psychology of philosophy. How Buddhism debunks, how Buddhism refutes, rejects philosophical speculation. Not through philosophical argumentation, that's important. Buddhism criticizes philosophical arguments not by resorting to philosophical arguments, not by resorting to logico-dialectics, but by psychological analysis, through analysis of the psychological factors. This, yeah. I'm sorry. This is what I have described as the Buddhist psychology of philosophy. It's an entirely new approach. You never hear this in any other philosophy, either in the East or in the West. The Buddhist psychology of philosophy. What this means? This means, rather than resorting to logic and argumentation, Buddhism seeks to transcend. Transcend means to go beyond. Transcend all views and ideologies. This is done through a diagnosis of their psychological mainsprings, the psychological factors responsible for their emergence and prevalence in the world. That's clear. What this really means, Buddhism takes into consideration the psychological factors serving as causes for the emergence of ideological positions. The underlying premise is this. That's important. The underlying premise for this is our desires and expectations have a direct impact on what we choose to believe in. So, from Buddhist perspective, all metaphysical speculations are merely externalizations of our deep-seated desires and innate anxieties. Some of these speculative views and ideologies could...
Sorry. Might be easier if you talk.
So I can.
You can do this.
Yeah. Some of these speculative views and ideologies could appear as very lofty and profound, beautiful and awe-inspiring. Nonetheless, the Buddhist position is they are but rationalizations of our self-centered desires to satisfy our innermost yearnings and our compulsive urges. Now, the textual evidence for this Buddhist perspective comes from the first discourse in the long collection of the Pali Buddhist canon. The first discourse in the Pali Buddhist canon is called the all-embracing net of views. It begins by making a reference to all the views, religious and philosophical views that were current during the time of the Buddha. It contains, this particular dialogue contains some 62 religious philosophical views on the nature of the self and the world. That's important. They are all concerned with the nature of the self and the nature of the world. They all have as their epistemological ground logic and pure reasoning, Pali Takka Vimamsa, or experience gained in mental concentration, that is Cheto Samadhi, or a combination of both. Those are the epistemological grounds. Now, all these 62 views contained in the first discourse of the long discourses, we can categorize them into 62. As follows. The categorization of the 62 views. First, theism. Theism, as you know, is the belief in a creator God. Theism, the belief in a creator God. Second, eternalism. That is the spiritual view that physical body is perishable, but the metaphysical self is eternal or immortal. This is the view shared by all religions in the world except Buddhism. The second view, the spiritual view. The physical body is perishable, the metaphysical self is eternal and immortal. Because all religions other than Buddhism recognize a metaphysical self, a metaphysical soul. Then, as against that, there's nihilism. Actually, the correct form should be annihilationism. Annihilationism. So the opposite view is the materialist view that the self is the same as the physical body. They identify the physical body with the self, and therefore it is perishable at the time of death, with no possibility for post-mortem existence. That is the materialist view. Then there is cosmogony. Cosmogony. It raises some question. Whether the world is eternal or non-eternal in terms of time, or whether the world is finite or infinite in terms of space. Those are the four questions raised by cosmogony. Then we come on to fortuitism. Fortuitism, that is the fortuitous view that the world has arisen haphazardly, fortuitously, accidentally, without any rhyme or reason. Then last we have skepticism. The skeptical view that with our limited faculties we cannot fathom the unlimited reality, and therefore the need to suspend all categorical judgments. Yes. Now we come to the Buddhist distinction between two kinds of views. Buddhism distinguishes between two kinds of views. The first is the belief in a self or soul, attavada. The first is the belief in a self or soul, attavada, considered as the essence of human beings, because all religions consider the self or the soul to be the essence of the human being. Only human beings have the self, but not animals. The second, all forms of speculative metaphysics intended to explain the nature of the self, attavada patisanyutta, and the nature of the world, lokavada patisanyutta. So here we, sorry, yeah, okay. Yes, there are two views here. The first is the belief in the self, other is all speculative views. So since Buddhism does not believe in a self, Buddhism never says the self, it always says the belief in self. Because there is no self, there is only the belief in self, the notion of self. Therefore, according to Buddhism, what disappears when we attain liberation is not the soul, is not the self, but the belief in the self, the belief in the soul. Yes, please. Of these two kinds of views, first is primary, second is derivative. Because in the final analysis, the first serves as a base for the emergence of the second. In other words, all varieties of speculative metaphysics, whatever form they assume, are finally traceable to the belief in a permanent selfhood, the nation of a self-existent subject which is impervious to change, which is not subject to change. What we call the idea of self, as we all know, assumes many forms. It appears as I in ordinary discourse. In our ordinary discourse and conversation, we refer to it as I. Then it is called soul in religion. Then it is called ego in philosophy. Whatever form it assumes, from the Buddhist perspective, from the Buddhist point of view, it's a fallacious assumption. It's a conception without corresponding objective counterpart. Its emergence is entirely due to psychological reasons. Now we come to the Buddhist theory of cognition. Buddhist theory of cognition means how we cognize mental and physical objects, how we perceive mental and physical objects. That is called the theory of cognition. So this situation becomes clear from the Buddhist theory of cognition, that is how we cognize mental and physical objects. Now, according to Buddhism, what we consider to be our apparently continuous psychological experience is analyzable, is reducible into a series of discrete cognitive acts. A cognitive act is a unit of consciousness. Discrete cognitive acts or units of consciousness. Each cognitive act in turn consists of a number of cognitive events such as sensory contact, feeling, perception, investigation, all leading up to a complex stage called conceptual proliferation. That's the final stage. The Pali word is papancha. It's a very important technical term, papancha. Papancha. Conceptual proliferation. Now, according to Buddhism, the whole cognitive process is an entirely impersonal process. It is an impersonal process. There is no self-entity behind the cognitive process that experiences the object, nor is there an agent that directs the various mental activities. They take place naturally according to the principles of psychological order called Chitta Niyama, where each stage in the continuum, where each stage in the series is conditioned by the immediately preceding one. However, in every cognitive process of an unenlightened person, that's the person who has not attained Nibbana. We are all unenlightened persons. The Pali word is putujjana, putujjana, ordinary unenlightened person. In every cognitive process of the unenlightened person, the latent tendency for the ego consciousness awakens and gradually solidifies, eventually becoming fully crystallized at the final stage called conceptual proliferation. Once the ego consciousness has arisen, it cannot exist in a vacuum. It needs ontological support. It needs concrete form and content. In this regard, the unenlightened person identifies the ego consciousness in relation to the five aggregates, the five component parts into which Buddhism analyzes the individual living being. They are corporeality, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and the fifth is consciousness. This process of identification takes the following form. This is mine, etam mama. Etam mama. That is due to craving. When you say, this is mine, you declare your ownership over something. This is mine, etam mama. That is due to craving. This I am, eso hamasmi. That is due to asmimana. That is mana, that is self-measurement. Self-measurement. The third is, this is myself, eso me atta. That is due to wrong view. This is how the ideas of my, I, and my own self intrude into what otherwise is an impersonal and egoless congeries of mental and physical phenomena. Of these three notions of self, the first is due to craving, tanha, the second is due to conceit, mana, and the third is due to wrong view, ditti. What is called self-conceit arises at a pre-rational level, whereas the idea of self, although conditioned by craving, arises at an elementary reflective level. The self-view is also called the personality view, the sakkaya ditti. That's the Pali term used to refer to personality view. Because the personality view affirms the presence of an abiding self in the psychophysical organism in one of 20 ways. For example, if we take consciousness as for an example, if consciousness, for instance, is to be assumed as self, such an assumption could manifest itself in 4 ways. Consciousness is the same as self, as in the case of a flame of a lamp, which is identical with its visual appearance. Self possesses consciousness, just as a tree has a shadow. Consciousness is within the self, just as the scent is in the flower. The self is in consciousness, just as a gem in a casket. When this description is extended to the other four aggregates as well, there are in all 20 possible relations between the five aggregates and the hypothetical self. This is how Buddhism explains the origin of the erroneous belief in a self-entity, that is Sakkaya Ditthi Samudaya. This is important. Once the belief in a self-entity has arisen, it becomes the base for a countless number of metaphysical, cosmological and theological theories. That's it. The self view gives rise to a large number of metaphysical and theological theories. Therefore, we read in the Samyutta Nikaya what's called the connected discourses of the Buddha. There we read, "Now, householder, as to those diverse views that arise in the world, and as to these 62 views set forth in the discourse on the all-embracing net of views, it is owing to the self-view that they arise. And if the self-view exists not, they do not exist." So all views are ultimately traceable to the self-view. As the above quotation clearly indicates, shows, all philosophical views which seek to explain the nature of the self and the universe can be traced to the belief in a permanent individualized self. Now, according to the Buddhist doctrine of dependent arising, that the Buddhist doctrine of causality, there are four kinds of grasping owing to craving. According to this doctrine, craving gives rise to four kinds of grasping. Clinging. Grasping means clinging. You cling to something, you grasp something. So craving is the cause of four kinds of grasping or clinging. One of the four, is grasping of the self-notion. The clinging to the self-notion is one. Since grasping of the self-notion arises due to craving, it follows from the above quotation that all philosophical views have craving as their base. Then we come the Buddha and the unanswered questions, the undetermined question. There are some questions which were not determined by the Buddha. We call them avyakata or unanswered question. The above quotation in the Samyutta Nikaya is important from another aspect. Some modern scholars have given many interpretations as to why the Buddha deemed it necessary to observe silence on some 10 questions. Many scholars have given many answers as to why the Buddha maintained silence on some 10 questions. These questions relate to the nature of the world, whether the world is eternal or non-eternal in terms of time, or whether the world is finite or infinite in terms of space, or whether the life principle and the physical body are identical or not, and whether the post-mortem, that is after death, the after death or the post-mortem status of Tathagata, that is the one who has attained enlightenment, is one of existence or non-existence, both or neither. Some scholars maintain that if the Buddha did not answer these questions, it was because the Buddha did not know the answers to them. Some others maintain that the Buddha's silence was due to practical reason, that is, the Buddha knew the answers but for practical reasons he withheld it. And some other scholars went to the extent of saying that the 10 questions belong to a class of profound metaphysics bordering on mysticism, that they could be answered only by what is paradoxically called a thunderous silence, that is, a silence more communicative than vocal expression. None of these explanations can be justified on textual or doctrinal evidence. As the above quotation clearly indicates, if the Buddha observed silence on the 10 undetermined questions, it was because they are all meaningless questions. Because they all arise, they are all based on the erroneous self-view. The view that there is an abiding self-entity within the constantly changing psychophysical organism. According to Buddhism, the notion of self has two versions, two varieties. One version is called eternalism, sassatavada. Other version is called annihilationism, uchchedavada. Eternalism, this is the spiritualist version of the self. It is presented in Buddhist texts as that which makes a clear distinction between a self-entity on the one hand and the physical body on the other. It makes a clear distinction between the physical self and the metaphysical, the physical body and the metaphysical self. This theory thus assumes a duality between two basic principles, one spiritual and the other material, a permanent metaphysical self or soul on the one hand and the temporary physical body on the other. Accordingly, a human being's true essence is to be found not in the perishable physical body but in the permanent metaphysical self. Hence, this theory came to be presented in the Buddhist text as eternalism, sassatavada in Pali, that is the belief in an eternal self, the belief in an immortal self. Let us call this theory the theory of the metaphysical self, while noting at the same time that all religions and philosophies that subscribe to it are, from the Buddhist point of view, different versions of eternalism. The opposite view is the materialist version of the self. It's a reaction against the spiritualist view of the self and is presented in the Buddhist text as that which asserts the complete identity of the self and the physical body. According to this theory, a human being's true essence is to be found not in an elusive metaphysical principle but in the empirical observable physical body. If the self and the physical body are identical, it follows that with the breakup of the body at the time of death, the self itself comes to naught, to complete annihilation. Hence, this theory came to be presented in Buddhist text as annihilationism, or the annihilationist theory of the self. Let us call this theory the theory of the physical self, while noting at the same time that all materialist views that subscribe to it are, from the Buddhist perspective, different versions of annihilationism. Early Buddhism presents these two views as occupying a position of binary or dialectical opposition, while describing its own position as one that sets itself equally aloof from both of them. It is in fact against the background of these two views that Buddhist teachings are often presented. The conclusion suggests itself, therefore, that from its very beginning, Buddhism considered itself as a critical response to the mutual opposition between the spiritualist and the materialist ideologies. Yes, we come to the middle position now. These two views, that is, the eternalist and the annihilationist view, these two views, according to the Buddha, prevail throughout the history of humankind's intellectual thought. That's simple. Thus, addressing Kachana, the Buddha says, this world, O Kachana, for the most part, depends upon a duality, upon the notion of existence and the notion of non-existence. But one who sees the origin of the world as it really is with correct wisdom, there is no notion of non-existence in regard to the world. And for one who sees the cessation of the world as it really is with correct wisdom, there is no notion of existence in regard to the world. All exist Kachana, this is one extreme. All does not exist, this is the second extreme. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma by the middle. Here, the notions of existence and the notion of non-existence mean the spiritualist and materialist views. For these two are sometimes introduced as the view of existence, the Pali expression is Bhavadikti, and the view of non-existence, Vibhavadikti. As Buddhism understands, these two views are two versions of the self-theory. The first is its metaphysical version, and the second its physical version, a position of mutual exclusion to which the Buddha refers thus. Monks, there are these two views, the view of being and the view of non-being. Any recluses or Brahmins who rely on the view of being, adopt the view of being, accept the view of being, are opposed to the view of non-being. Any recluses or Brahmins who rely on the view of non-being, adopt the view of non-being, accept the view of non-being, are opposed to the view of being. According to Buddhism's diagnosis of spiritual eternalism, that is the belief in a permanent self-entity, its origin can be traced to what is called the craving for eternal life. The craving for eternal life is the cause of the eternalist view. It's called bhavatanna in Pali. It's the desire for the immortality of the soul. It is the desire for the eternalization of the self. The desire to perpetuate individual existence into eternity. On the other hand, the psychological origin of materialism, that is the belief in a temporary self-entity, can be traced to the craving for eternal death, that is vibhavatanna, the desire for self-annihilation. It is the desire to see the complete annihilation of the individual existence at the time of death, without any prospect of after death or post-mortem survival. What seems to be assumed here is that materialism resists the belief in survival because of its fear of moral retribution. For this view gives an open license to live our lives without being burdened by a sense of moral accountability. The mutual opposition between spiritualist eternalism and materialist annihilism shows not only the perennial conflict between two mutually exclusive philosophical views, but also the human mind's oscillation between two deep-seated desires. There is another important aspect of the Buddhist critique of views and ideologies. Buddhism does not endorse dogmatic adherence to views even if they are right. That's important. You cannot cling to rights even if they are views even if they are right. To be infatuated with the rightness of one's own views and ideologies is called Sanditti Raga in Pali. The dogmatic attachment to them is called Ditti Paramas. The root cause of both is the belief that this alone is true and all else is false. We have a tendency to say, my religion, my philosophy, my ideology is true, all else is false. They have that tendency. So the root cause of both is the belief that this alone is true and all else is false. It is this kind of warped attitude that provides a fertile ground for bigotry and dogmatism, what Buddhism calls idam satya vinivesa. Its external manifestations, as we all know, are acts of fanaticism and militant piety, indoctrination and unethical conversion, religious fundamentalism and persecution, not to speak of interpersonal conflicts and acts of terrorism often leading to internecine warfare. From the Buddhist point of view, therefore, dogmatic attachment to ideologies is very much more dangerous, is very much more detrimental and fraught with more danger than our inordinate attachment to material things. That's important. Interreligious and intra-religious wars are a case in point. The Cold War between capitalism and communism, which had nearly brought the world into the brink of a nuclear disaster, is another case in point. If Buddhism does not encourage dogmatic attachment to views, it is because from the Buddhist way of looking at it, a view is only a guide to action. A view is only a guide to action. In this well-known discourse on the parable of the raft, called Kullupam in Pali, the Buddha tells us that his teaching should be understood not as a goal unto itself, but as a means to the realization of the goal. Because it has only, the Dhamma has only instrumental value. The Dhamma is only an instrument. The Buddhist, now we come, yes, the Buddhist teachings only as a means to an end. When Vachagotta, a well-known wandering philosopher, asked the Buddha, does the venerable Buddha Gautama has a view of his own? The Buddha said, the Tathagata Vacha has given up all views. However, the Tathagata has viewed thus, this is materiality, this is arising, this is cessation, this is feeling, this is perception, this is these are mental formation, this is consciousness. Here, arising and cessation should be understood in a psychological sense. It means the arising and cessation of attachment to the five aggregates, the aggregates into which Buddhism analyzes individual existence. Thus, the teaching of the Buddha, as the Buddha himself says, has only relative value. Relative to the realization of the goal. It's a thing to be used, not a thing to be ritually adulated. What this clearly implies is that even the right view like all other views, is a conceptual model serving as a guide to action. If it is called right view, it is because it leads us directly to the right goal. The right goal, according to Buddhism, is a right vision, samma dasan, into the nature of actuality, yathabhuta. According to Buddhism, the world of conditioned experience, that is the world in which we live, all of us live in the world of conditioned experience. According to Buddhism, the world of conditioned experience is a world of construction. On the other hand, Nibbana means its complete deconstruction. Samsara is Sankhara, Nibbana is Visankhara. One is construction, other is deconstruction. Therefore, immediately after he is attaining Nibbana, the Buddha says, my mind has come to a state of deconstruction. Visankhara gasanchita. I have realized the ending of all craving. Tannanam kayam ajaga. So cessation of suffering means cessation of craving. Cessation of craving means cessation of views. Cessation of views means that the mind has come not to destruction, but to deconstruction. Deconstruction. When the mind has reached deconstruction, the five aggregates do remain, yet they are no more constructed. In the sense, the Tathagata does not impose on them any kind of craving or clinging. That which is selfless, hard it is to see. Not easy is it to perceive the truth. But who has ended craving utterly has not to cling to, he alone can see. What takes place when Nibbana is realized is not a change in the nature of reality. That's important. What takes place when Nibbana is realized is not a change in the nature of reality, but it's a change in our perspective of reality, of the nature of reality. It's a change in our perspective of the nature of reality. The fact of impermanence is not a problem in itself. It becomes a problem when it is wrongly perceived as permanence. This is what is called perception of permanence in impermanence. In the same way, the fact of non-self is not a problem in itself. It becomes a problem when it is wrongly perceived as the self. This is what is called perception of self in what is not the self. Thus, for Buddhism, what actually matters is not the nature of the world per se, but the world as interpreted and constructed through the lens of our egocentric perspectives, our views and beliefs, our speculative theories and dogmatic assertion. What comes to an end when Nibbana is realized is not the nature of reality, rather it is a wrong interpretation of the world. Our final conclusion is early Buddhism is not a philosophy, it's a metaphilosophy, a philosophy that explains the very nature of philosophy. Stated otherwise, the final goal, the ultimate goal of Buddhism is not to have a view, but to view. I have some more to add. The reason for this whole, you hear? Yes. The reason for this whole situation is the Buddhist doctrine of non-self. It is the Buddhist doctrine of non-self. The doctrine of non-self is unique to Buddhism. Now, the early Buddhism refers to the fact that the doctrine of non-self is not known to any other religious teacher or philosopher. This is clearly mentioned in the discourse called Lion's Road in the Majjhima Nikaya. Then this is also important. Whenever the Buddha describes his teachings like karma or causality or rebirth, he refers to parallel doctrines. But when it comes to the doctrine of non-self, you never see any reference to parallel doctrine. Why? Because there were no parallel doctrines. The doctrine of non-self is unique to Buddhism. Then a famous Buddhist teacher called Yasomitra, he is a celebrity of the Sautrantika school of Buddhism. In his famous book Abhidharma Kosa Bhashya, he says that among all world teachers, the Buddha is the only religious teacher who proclaimed the doctrine of non-self. Then, sometime later in the 5th century AD, Venerable Buddhaghosa, the Theravada commentator, says that the Buddhist doctrine of non-self is unique to Buddhism. He says anicca, impermanence, dukkha, suffering are not important. Even whether the Buddhas are there or not, the fact of impermanence and the fact of suffering can be discovered, but not the idea of non-self. Then some Buddhist scholars maintain that Buddha denied only the empirical self. Some modern scholars maintain that the Buddha denied only the empirical self, but not the overself. There's an overself. There's an overself, a metaphysical self, a transcendental self. This is certainly not true, because if that is the case, there were many schools of Buddhist thought, Theravada, Mahayana, Tantrayana. Under each there are many other schools, but there's no evidence to suggest that any of these Buddhist schools refer to a theory of a transcendental self. That's, if there is a transcendental self, then we have to come to the very wrong conclusion that all these Buddhist schools misunderstood what the Buddha taught. According to Buddhism, this is important. Yes, this is very important. According to Buddhism, the Buddha defines what is called all. What is all? Totality. The all. All means totality, correct? All. The totality, the entirety. What is all? The Buddha's answer is the all means the I, the 5 physical sense organs, the mind, and the corresponding sense objects. There are 12, no? There are 12. Or the 18 dhatus. Eye, color, eye consciousness. Ear, sound, ear consciousness. Like that, there are 18. This is what is called world. This is the whole world. There is no other world. This is very important. According to Buddhism, this is the only world. There is absolutely no other world. Within this world, there is no God, but there can be the God idea. There is no soul, but there can be the soul idea. The idea can be there, but not the soul or the God. So it is this. So when the Buddha says sabbe, now the Buddha says sabbe dhamma anatta, all dhammas, all conditioned as well as unconditioned things are anatta. Anatta means empty. Empty means non-self. Non-self and empty are mutually convertible terms. What is non-self is empty, what is empty is non-self. In other words, the whole world, what is called all, is empty, empty of any self or anything pertaining to self. This is the significance of the Buddhist doctrine of non-self. Yes, please.
And now we're opening the floor to questions. Anyone who has a question, please raise your hand, and Professor will be very happy to answer your questions.
Professor Karunadasa. My question would be, you see academics and some monastics teach a number of views, or at least teach a rich, or many rich interpretations of Buddhist philosophy. There have been many throughout the centuries. You mentioned Madhyamika, Tantrayana, and so on.
I can hear.
You can hear. What is your take on, I guess, the promulgation of different ideas amongst Buddhists? Is this a favorable activity for academics such as yourself and others to do, or is there a better way to end at the alleviation of suffering?
Yes, what I explained is what is found in the Buddhist discourses. There's a difference between theory and practice always. In every religion, in every philosophy, there's also difference between what is taught and what is practiced. I am not referring to how it is practiced now. I was referring how it is presented in the early Buddhist discourses. When it is not the case that Buddha did not have any views. Views mean mundane views. I am referring to metaphysical views. Buddhism does not have a metaphysical view. Otherwise, the Buddha had many other views. Now I have my view of the table. It has 4 legs. That is my view of the table. Like that, we can have many views. Those are mundane views. They are not metaphysical views. Yes, please. Yes, Venerable.
Yes, Venerable.
Yes, Venerable.
Thank you, Professor. Your lecture is very interesting for us. And I have one question for you. And according to the Buddhism, person is consists of the 18 tattoos.
What?
18 person, 18 tattoos.
18?
18 tattoos. 8 is spheres. A person. A person. Tattoos, yeah.
What are 18 dhatus?
Yeah.
Let's answer.
So we have no self.
Yeah, 18 dhatus.
18 dhatus.
The 6 sense organs,
Yes.
the 6 sense objects,
Yes,
and
yes.
the resulting 6 kinds of
Yes.
sense consciousness, 18.
Yes.
That's right.
So we have say impermanent and we know self. So, but in the Mahayana and the Sarasvata, there's a different views.
Yeah.
Because the person after days and before the next rebirth, there's a connection between the death and the arising of birth. So in Theravada, we don't have this kind of sense.
No. Yes,
We don't have this sense. How to connection after person death and carry his virtues, his karmas to the next life. Because after death, the physical body is destroyed, or the mental activities is also decay. So there's also connection between the death and the rebirth in
Yes,
the Theravada
absolutely.
and Theravada doctrines.
Yeah, actually, strictly speaking, Buddhism does not refer to rebirth. In Pali, it will be punarupati. Punarupati, if it's punarupati, then that's rebirth. Rebirth means transmigration of the soul from one birth to another. What Buddhism teaches is re-becoming. The Pali word is punabhava, re-becoming. It's a process. It is not the case that something transits from one birth to the other, but it's a process of going, process of becoming. Even now, I am dying and being born every moment. But you are referring to Sarvastivada and Mahayana, of course, there are 2 different paradigms. Early Buddhism is one paradigm, Sarvastivada is another paradigm. Mahayana is another paradigm. You can explain what is valid in one paradigm with reference to the what is valid in another paradigm. That's a different problem. We must not mix up. Whenever
Yes.
yeah.
Professor, I have two questions here.
That is it.
Not from me, but from the floor as well. Okay, the first one is, Professor, yes, does Buddhism have a view on the scientific concept of randomness?
Oh, I don't know. No, I'm sorry, I must admit my ignorance of science. Does Buddhism have a view on the scientific concept of randomness? What is randomness? Happening haphazardly, not in order, haphazard happening. There's no order, just accidentalism, something like accidentalism, just happening without rhyme or reason. Just that idea is there in Buddhism. Now, I mean, it's referred to, the Buddha referred to that, but I mentioned that in the one. I mentioned that fact, that that fortuitism, we are correct, fortuitism. It is called fortuitism. It is there.
Sorry,
Jared?
it doesn't work now.
Jared?
It's random, sorry.
You can just randomly answer these questions if you like. Okay, I'll ask you the next one, Professor, on behalf of one of our attendees today. Buddhism denies self thoroughly, thus invalidating the philosophical views and metaphysical speculations that are based upon it. However, nowadays, there are many controversial social issues that are not covered in the original Buddhist canons, such as euthanasia, homosexuality, human rights, etc., while they are extensively discussed in the modern philosophy. For example, philosophy of science, politics, psychology, and etc. So my question is, or this person's question is, from a pragmatic perspective, Professor, can a Buddhist take these philosophical viewpoints as references in order to solve or at least confront real-life problems? Does Nibbana have to be exclusive from the modern life? Can we find a balance? So this person is asking you many big questions. So again, you can randomly answer these questions. So I think short, in summary, this person is asking you whether early Buddhism, can early Buddhism be applied to the modern world?
Modern situation. Of course,
Yes.
there's no different modern problems as there, but we can find out from early Buddhist teachings. We can deduct what should be the Buddhist attitude. There's no particular mention of the Buddhist attitude to present-day problems. That we can't expect Buddha to say all things related to the present world, but we can deduce from what the Buddha taught the Buddhist attitude to most of these Buddhist problems. The relevance of Buddhism to modern life. We have to, that is the problem, that's the issue. This is too long.
Yes, too long. But I think you can address on the Buddhist perspective on human rights, homosexuality, and euthanasia, perhaps.
Homosexuality is not a problem for Buddhism. It's not a problem. Lesbianism is not a problem. Whether a person is married or not, those are irrelevant matters. Buddhism does not control our social life. As a religion, Buddhism does, now in Buddhism Buddhism does not say that you must marry one woman, two women, or no women. In Islam, you can marry many women according to Western ethics, one man can have only one woman, monogamy, but Buddhism never says that. Monogamy, polygamy, polyandry, anything is valid, provided it is the system that is available at the given moment. If today there is polygamy, no, there is nothing wrong. In itself, intrinsically, there is nothing wrong in polygamy, polyandry, or homosexuality, or lesbianism.
So in other words, Buddhism is very open-minded.
Very open. Buddhism does not reduce cultural diversity into a monogamy, into a monolithic. Yes, because Buddhism. What about the Buddhism is not a culture-based religion. That is very important. Buddhism, among all world religions, Buddhism is not culture-based. Now take Hinduism. Hinduism cannot go from India to America without a Hindu going from India to America. The Hindu must go with the religion. The religion alone cannot go. Then Islam also like that. Now Islam cannot go from. No, what I want to say. Now, if an American becomes a Muslim, he will have to follow the social philosophy. He cannot be cremated, correct? When he died, he cannot be cremated. Then he will have to have a Muslim name. Then he can't eat pork. So there are many taboos. In Buddhism, there are no such taboos. Absolutely no such. There's nothing called Buddhist medicine, Buddhist food, Buddhist clothes, nothing of the sort. Look at me, I'm a Buddhist, but any sign? No. No signs. There are no external manifestations of Buddhism.
Thank you, Professor. You have something to add? Yes.
Sure. Just along. Okay, so your talk was meant to explain a kind of Buddhist skepticism towards metaphysical questioning and metaphysical views and philosophy, but philosophy also involves not just metaphysics but also ethics or ethical philosophy. And so, would you apply that same type of skepticism towards metaphysics in early Buddhist texts towards ethical philosophy? And ethical views, are they to be jettisoned or given up in the same way as we ought to give up metaphysical views?
Buddhism is against only metaphysical views, theological views, cosmological views, which have no relevance to our day-to-day activities. Buddhism is concerned only with this life. I said all, I described the all. So, in Buddhism, psychology and ethics play a very, very important role. Actually, the whole of Buddhism is a psychology. Even ethics is an extension of Buddhist psychology. So the Buddhism does not deny the validity of psychology or the validity of ethics. They are very much appreciated.
Yes.
Yes,
Please. Any response?
whether the clinging towards views, do I need to?
Attachment to views. Can you please elaborate?
And can you
more
elaborate that in the ethical context?
in the ethical context?
Yes, it is an ethical question, attachment that comes under ethics, attachment to views. Attachment to views, desire, self-centered desire for views, egocentric desire for views. That is ethical.
And
From ethical point of view, from ethical perspective.
is it possible to be attached to ethical views in Buddhism as well?
Ethical views, why not? You don't call it. There's a lot of ethics in Buddhism.
Right, but there can also be attachment to ethical views.
The Buddhist ethics begins like this: all living beings desire happiness. They recoil from suffering. Not only human beings, all living beings, whether we are human or animal, all living beings desire happiness. That is the premise behind Buddhist ethical living. Therefore, it is your duty not to harm any living creature. That is where Buddhism begins. Buddhism begins with the 5 precepts. They are not commandments from above. They are not injunctions from above. I myself take upon myself the 5 precepts.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. I just want to ask 2 questions. One is, so does Buddhism reject all other philosophies and religions, or it could be mixed together?
No, Buddhism never condemns any other religion. This is very important. The Buddha never condemned any religion. Actually, Buddha refers to other religious teachers as those who maintain the moral life, Kammavadino. I can't remember, the Buddhism refers to 4 kinds of religions, and never does the Buddha condemn any of those religions. He says they are not wrong, but they are not satisfactory. That is the word used. Anasasik. They are not necessarily wrong. Even the belief in God is not necessarily wrong, but it is not satisfactory. The belief in God is not condemned as wrong. What the Buddha says is he keeps himself away from it because it is not satisfactory, anasasika. That is the Buddhist attitude. When there are 2 conflicting views, Buddhism keeps itself aloof from both without getting involved in any kind of argumentation.
Is it possible to mix together?
Pardon?
Is it possible to mix different philosophies and religions with Buddhism?
To mix philosophy.
Yeah.
Is it possible for other religions to be combined or mixed with
No,
Buddhism?
that is called eclecticism. That's called eclecticism. You take something from there, something from there, put together. No, that will be a what? That will not resemble the nature of reality as such. Today there's an attempt like that. There's a dialogue between religions. No, I don't think that's correct. We don't say one religion is higher than another religion. Say one religion is different from the other religion. That's the best way. My religion is different from your religion. Your religion is different from his religion. No religion is higher or lower than another. That's the best way to approach.
And one more. Could you tell us a little bit about the situation in Sri Lanka with the Muslims and the Buddhists?
I don't want to comment on that. I don't want to comment on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
That is, I was discussing that. That's due to exclusivism, fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism. I discussed that. Very important aspect of Buddhism. This alone is true, all else is false. That is the base from which those ideas come. My religion alone is true, all else is false. That is called exclusivism. Idang eva satyam. This alone is true, all else is empty. Fundamentalism. Religious. There's a lot of, Buddha has many things to say about religious fundamentalism. Religious fundamentalism is there between the same religion sometimes, intra-religious. It can be intra-religious. 2 factions of the same religions, or between 2 different religions, intra and inter, inter-religious and inter-religious. So fundamentalism is now sweeping throughout the world. That's the biggest problem, fundamentalism.
Thank you, Professor. I apologize on behalf of the Buddha-Dharma Center for all the technical issues that we have today with the microphones. We are only a registered non-profit organization, so that's why these are the equipments that we can afford. And if anyone would like to make donations to us in order for us to upgrade our system, that will be very much appreciated. So, any other questions? We have many gentlemen asking questions today, but no ladies at the moment. Any ladies would like to raise the question to Professor? Well, if there's no more questions, then we will end the talk here today. Once again, please join me in thanking Professor Karunadasa for giving us a very inspiring talk. Thank you so much, Professor. As some of you might know, Professor is already 85 years old this year. He has been teaching and researching on early Buddhism for more than half a century, and thanks to him, generations of students have built a solid foundation in early Buddhism and Theravada Abhidharma because of Professor Karunadasa's work. So, Professor, thank you very much once again for all your contributions to the Buddhist academic world. And thank you for spending time coming to Hong Kong 3 months every year, even at your age, but you look so healthy and robust, still coming to Hong Kong every 3 months every year, well, 3 months every year. So thank you so much to you, and also to Mrs. Karunadasa. And last but not least, thank you very much to each and every one of you for taking the time to come to our talk here today.